With corporate power looming behind them, nation-states have failed to deliver on their promise of security for populations in the most dramatic conceivable way, by allowing the warming of the climate to put ours and future generations' lives at risk. During this session, we will take a look at the perception in the West of this crisis, its reality, and the paths that societies can take to reverse this trend and assure the survival of future generations. Here to discuss this topic with us is Martin Lukash, environmental journalist from Canada and writer for The Guardian and the newly founded The Breach media outlet. Martin is also the author of The Trudeau Formula: Seduction and Betrayal in an Age of Discontent. Joining Martin in the latter part of the session will be Ridhima Pandey, youth climate activist from India. Ridhima gained global prominence in 2017 when, at the age of 9, she filed a lawsuit against the Indian government for not adhering to its targets set under the Paris Climate Accords. Ridhima was also amongst 16 children to file a complaint with the UN in 2019 for violations of its Convention on the Rights of the Child due to the climate crisis.
Welcome to everyone to this third session on the Alternative Security Conference about the ecological crisis. I'm Tom Stopford, member of DiEM25's Foreign Policy Group, the DiEM Spontaneous Collective on Peace and International Policy, and I'll be moderating the session today. We'll start out in the first part with a comparison of the way the climate crisis is perceived in the Western world and compare that to the reality of the crisis. Here to help us with that is Martin Lukash, as just announced, writer for The Guardian and The Breach media. Then in the second part of the session, we'll talk about solutions to the climate crisis. Joining Martin and me will be Ridhima Pandey, as just mentioned, climate youth activist from India. Also note that you'll have the chance to put your questions to the speakers in the comment section of the YouTube stream. We'll then try to forward them to the speakers at the end of each part of the session. So we'll have two short Q&As. So joining me now, Martin, thanks for being here. Glad to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I want to start out by asking you, how is the ecological crisis perceived in the West? How do our media portray it? What kind of causes are being identified? How are the effects portrayed?
Well, I think we're in the middle of a very fierce battle over the perceptions of the ecological crisis. And honestly, I think we've never been in a stronger position to determine what that perception is. But what we're up against has been very clear for a long time. I think in the official arenas of debate about the ecological crisis in the media, in legislatures, in elite circles, the crisis is still perceived in a dominant neoliberal ideology. So, you know, what we're presented with are techno-utopian solutions, you know, getting saved by a few billionaires, you know, swooping in on their, you know, fossil fuel-free jets or electric vehicles, or the solution is posed as one of kind of collective and stoic self-sacrifice. So, you know, we all know the script that is repeated in, you know, mainstream television to us regularly. Have fewer children, drive less, recycle, print less paper, use decompostable, edible hemp pens. You know, it gets to truly epically absurd heights in some cases. And I think what that has meant is that the climate crisis for too long has been perceived as a fight without enemies. And we all of us are to some extent have a small, on account of consumption, have a small amount of complicity in the system. But oil companies have taken advantage of this and spun it into relentless propaganda over the decades. And that approach can be summed up in the Pogo cartoon that some people may know, which is the line that, we have met the enemy and it is us, right? So just in the way that neoliberalism has freed corporations to treat the atmosphere like a sewage dump, it has also encouraged us to turn to feeble individualistic responses when it comes to the climate crisis. So I think when it comes to the perception, we've all, to some degree, internalized the creed of neoliberalism, which tells us to act as consumers instead of citizens, as atomized individuals instead of deeply social collectives. So I think that has been the kind of great ideological con of our age, is to put all this relentless pressure on individuals to green their lives, when in fact we know it's corporations and the underlying capitalist political economy which is responsible for the brunt of climate change. Tom, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. So as you were saying at the end, the real causes aren't being talked about. There's a focus on consumption as a way to combat the crisis and so on. Could you expand a little bit more on the causes then of the crisis that are not in the front of the media coverage?
Right. Well, I mean, we know that despite the relentless talk about all of us being individually responsible for climate change, we know that just 100 companies, fossil fuel companies, have been the source of more than 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in the past 3 decades. So, our actual enemies don't only have names and addresses, as someone once put it, but they could literally be fit into one giant San Francisco or London mansion, right? So there's that there's a very narrow layer of fossil fuel executives who have, with full knowledge, in fact, with knowledge well before anyone else, thanks to their climate science departments, had full knowledge of the impact of their business model and have continued, despite their awareness, in fact, have for decades funded right-wing misinformation and disinformation campaigns to sow confusion in the public, in the media, and to delay any climate action. And I think, more broadly speaking, ideologically, climate change has often been presented as a single issue that can be siloed off, rather than being a symptom of a deeper dysfunction in our political economic system. So, the carbon is in the air because the economy put it there. And I think, there's a way in which not just, the dominant, the dominant ideology and the guardians of that ideology, but also I think to some extent the mainstream environmental movement, which is, over the last 5 to 10 years been changing, thankfully. There's a way in which they were guilty of a kind of carbon fundamentalism, which presented the use of fossil fuels as if it existed in a vacuum, disconnected from the, capitalist political economy in which we live, the racist and hierarchical organization of our society. In my country, Canada, settler colonial land theft and relentless extraction on indigenous lands. All of these are the true underlying causes of climate change and have to be reckoned with when we consider a path out of it. There's also a way in which I think mainstream environmentalism for so long has been guilty of a kind of enormous condescension of priority. The idea that the climate trumps all other issues, that we have to deal with them before we get to dealing with racism or militarism or inequality. But in fact, it's precisely those issues that are not just at the root, but are an accelerant. And there's a way in which climate change is a force multiplier for so many of these inequities in society. And that will likely, in fact, make our societies more unequal, more war-prone, more brutal and mean if we don't mount a challenge to those roots.
Just as a side comment, I think you can find that in great parts of the left, by the way, that there's a focus on quite a narrow range of issues, but not necessarily a connection to the deeper institutional structures in society, which are causing a lot of the problems that people are, concerned about. Moving on from this picture that is presented to us in the mainstream media, there's another open question, which is, what kind of an effect does this have on the general population that is exposed to it? How indeed do people see the issue? Are their attitudes changed by what they see on television or read in the newspapers? So maybe you could talk a bit about that, what kind of consequences it has on people's attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't overstate the effect that dominant ideology has on the population, because I still think to a large degree, certainly in my country, there's a huge appetite for bold, transformative policies with regard to the ecological and climate crisis. So in my country, 75 to 80% of people want to see something like the Green New Deal. They want to see increased taxation on the wealthy. They want to see expanded public services, all of the things that we need to combat the climate crisis. But I do think that there is a real disconnect between the mainstream perception of the climate crisis and where people are at. And I think that the impact that it has had on people has flattened and constricted our people's political imagination. So I think one element we certainly see in political culture is that there's a real difficulty to imagine alternatives to hyper unregulated capitalism. So, and I think we see that in a lot of the fictional and cinematic depictions of climate change, right, which is usually hyper dystopian. These projections of absolute worst case scenarios based on the presumption that the status quo politics could never change. There's this phrase from Frederick Jameson that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think what we're seeing in the media class is that it almost feels like it's easier for them to imagine the end of the world, an apocalypse, a climate apocalypse, than it is, the possibility of just imposing higher taxes on corporations to pay for a green transition, right? Like, we're not even talking about the end of capitalism. We're talking about bold social democratic measures that would actually rein in corporations and rein in, runaway, fossil fuel extraction. But I also think that, when we see coverage in the media that, that poses this threat of climate disasters, but then proposes merely solutions like changing your light bulb or having less children, there's, I think, a tendency for people to disconnect. Like, if you're saying it's this bad, but you're posing only these puny solutions, then either, it's not actually that serious, or climate change is not a problem at all. So I think that there's been a tendency for people as a result of that to disconnect and to become depoliticized when it comes to the climate crisis. That said, I think the movement that many of us have been a part of to build momentum for a global Green New Deal, I think has gone a long way to push back against this problem.
So not necessarily that people adopt exactly the picture that is being presented to them, but that they just feel disconnected and feel apathy with regard to the subject. What then about the environmental movements that have been growing in the last couple of years? The Fridays for Future movement, which is very prominent, the movement from Britain, the Extinction Rebellion, which has spread around the world as well. How are they being covered then? Considering this, what we heard just now, what is their role in it?
I think we've seen from the media the standard forms of, look, the media class live in the same bubble as the political class, and share many of the same values and perceptions. I think that we can expect the media to give a fair shake to these movements. So, we've seen them deride and smear and infantilize the social movements that are rising in this moment, and on many of the core issues on which we need movement, the media have often played a reactionary role. So, the elite media tend to present cuts to the poorest as belt tightening, but tax increases to the richest make them scream about class resentment. They deride regulation of corporate polluters as red tape, but applaud deregulation as an incentive to unleash innovation and the magic of the market. The media direct anger at the most vulnerable and direct it away from those who are most culpable for the crisis. So I think without a powerful and noisy movement of the sorts that we've seen in the last few years, and which need to grow, we can't hope for any shifts in the media coverage. We've gotten small improvements, but to a large degree, we're still seeing how, for instance, in the US media, coverage of and mention of the climate has actually gone down rather than increasing, even as we see climate disasters striking from coast to coast. So I think to a large degree, the solutions, the holistic solutions like the Green New Deal that we need are not being amplified to people through the mainstream media. They're getting out there through the vehicles and platforms that people are building in independent institutions, in grassroots political parties, in the rare left parliamentarians that we're seeing in the United States. Certainly people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who have played a huge role in mainstreaming these kinds of holistic solutions that really break with the neoliberal orthodoxy that has fenced in our political imagination for so long.
And we see the effects of that to some extent in the media as well. I see we're now reaching the question and answer period. I haven't received any question until now, so I'll just backtrack for a moment again, if that's all right, to this question of the causes, because I think there's a bit more to be said there about the climate crisis being a market failure, and this concept of externalities. The climate problems being externalities. Maybe you could talk a bit about that, since there haven't been any questions until now.
Sure. Well, it's undoubtedly true that that certainly over the last 40 years of the ascendance of neoliberalism, so many of precisely the kinds of public policy that we would need to avert the climate crisis have been considered beyond the pale by the mainstream political framework, right? So, the urgent reality to regulate corporations, to engage in a public-led transition to renewable energy, the need even for publicly owned corporations to lead that transition, to invest in renewable energy, to build the kind of infrastructure that we need to put us on better footing to handle the kind of shocks that we know we have already locked in, but also to build a much more abundant, equal, and humane society that really gives people a stake in the transition. All of those run headlong up against the neoliberal orthodoxy, right? That the market is always better, that government should stay out of regulating the market, and that we should leave things to the magic of the market. But as you say, the environmental costs, which have gone to the point now where they pose existential threat to the life support systems of this planet, are simply not taken into account by the market. So the real inconvenient truth of the climate crisis, as Naomi Klein has so insightfully written, is that we need to reverse so many of these reactionary, regressive, and neoliberal trends over the last 40 years. And I do think that that thankfully we're starting to see that in many places around the world. There has been this incredible insurgency against neoliberalism, and it's put many of these basic questions of basic levers of government power and policy back on the table. Those externalities finally have to be taken into account. And I think we're probably on better footing than we ever have been to do that.
Question from the audience now. Alexander Elejovic, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is asking, is pressure on the institutions the only thing we can do? Or can we also imagine people cooperating to solve the problems themselves through direct action and commons?
I mean, undoubtedly we have to use every tool we have in the toolbox. And I think that there's a lot to be said for combining a firm no with a compelling yes in the organizing that we do. So undoubtedly there needs to be direct action of the sort we've seen from Extinction Rebellion and anti-extractive movements around the world, forcing our governments to say no to endless fossil fuel extraction and putting an end to the opening of new carbon frontiers. And direct action has been at the center of that. And meanwhile, we certainly also have to build the popular power that movements have to push for those alternatives that we need. Paramount among them, the Green New Deal, which to my mind is the most compelling and exciting framework for collective political action that we've had, certainly in my generation, in my lifetime. So I think there's no doubt that collectivities and movements have a role to play in both, stopping the bad and pushing for the good.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a follow-up to that, expanding on the same topic. Another question. Robert Could asks, what about the democratization of companies and corporations? Could they help influencing the impact of climate change, also with regard to improving accountability?
Yeah, for me, it's hard to imagine us being able to win a just transition without that involving democratic economic planning. And I think I've been, and I know many people have certainly been inspired by the way that certainly the UK Labour Party under Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in the United States was putting forward, innovative policies that would see workers take greater stakes in companies, because I think if we leave private corporations to maintain their fiefdoms of power, we've seen that they will continue to have governments at their beck and call through lobbying, through legalized bribery. And I think that if we're not able to extend some measure of democratic control and planning over the private sector, we simply won't be able to usher in a transition in the amount of time that we have.
But just to better comprehend, are you thinking, while saying that, of institutional changes to the structure of the economic institutions, or are you thinking solely about regulating them more strongly than they have been in the last decades?
I mean, I think it has to be both. Like, I think we're at the point now where our movements are, digging ourselves out of a hole, in the sense that we have to contend with the hyper unregulated nature of so many of the key sectors that we need to rapidly decarbonize. So naturally, it does have to start with a very tough regulatory agenda of setting, everything from caps on production and exploration for fossil fuels, which we've seen certainly in some European countries. We're behind in Canada and the United States. A great deal more. We need to put our hands on the inordinate private wealth that both the fossil fuel companies have, but also the corporate sector across the board, and use that money to, pay for this transition. But I think over the longer run, we do have to move towards putting on the table questions of expropriation or nationalization. And I mean, over the long haul, certainly holding fossil fuel executives responsible in criminal courts at The Hague for the damage that they've wrought globally.
Perhaps the last question for this question and answer period. Chris Lothian asks, don't you think that the problems of environmental plundering, logging, commercial fishing, etc., are far more important than CO2 production?
I mean, I think that all of these ecological crises are interconnected, and that the problems of relentless resource extraction, whether that's fishing or logging or the emitting of carbon emissions, have at their core the same problem, which is a hyper unregulated fossil fuel capitalist system. And I think rather than imagining ourselves trying to fight these on different fronts, we have to get out of this siloed mentality. And to my mind, the Green New Deal is exciting as a framework for that, because it shows us that everything is connected, and it shows that if we can address those root crises, the symptoms can also be remedied.
Although one might add that the symptoms caused by CO2 production are the most urgent, since they pose the greatest danger. So there should be probably an emphasis on those, but not leaving the others out of the picture. I think we can go over to the second part of the session now with Ritima. Martin, thanks until here. Now, turning to Ridhima, thank you to you also for being on. Great to have you. I'd like to first of all start by asking you how you got involved in climate activism. What got you started? What was the initial motivation?
Mhm. So I guess that most of the time it happens, that as with youth, as being a child, we don't really realize an importance of something until and unless we face that ourselves. And that somewhere happened with me as well, because in 2013, when I was 6, I guess 5 or 6, there was a very devastating flash flood that happened in my home state, Uttarakhand. So when that flash flood occurred, my mom was watching TV and my dad went there to rescue the animals. So while my mom was watching TV, I wanted to watch cartoon, to be honest, but she didn't allow me, and she was like, you have to see what's been happening in the world. You can't just be in your, own imaginary world all the time. See how many people have been hurt and stuff like that. So I sat there, not very willingly, but when I saw, the visuals on that the reporters were showing us on the news, I was able to see Ganges getting, it was whole muddied water. The water level was really high. It was having broken tree branches and a material of broken houses. The place was destructed so badly. People and animals were hurt really very badly. They were crying, and they were saying that they're trying to find out their family members, but they can't, and they're scared if they're alive or not. And the kids were like, they don't know what they're gonna do if they won't find their parents, and their whole little world was devastated. And it made me really scared, and I asked my mom, that what was the reason, behind this destruction. And then she told me about flash floods and how they usually occur, and it made me really scared of um, thundering and raining. And even till today, I'm 13, but still scared of thundering. Whenever it thunders, I just be like, you don't better burst. I don't want the cloud to get bursted. I don't want to lose my parents. And I'm just really scared of thundering and flooding. So this fear, and somewhere, as I uh, as I used to experience this thing a lot, I asked my mom what was the reason behind the flash flood and how can I stop flooding. At that time, I didn't knew it was a natural phenomenon, and I can't do much to stop it. The only thing that I had in my mind was that I have to stop flooding. I just really have to, because I don't, I can't lose my parents. I can't lose my home. So then they sort of introduced me to what global warming is, and the way they explained me that, it was quite difficult to understand that in the beginning, while my dad was trying to make me understand that. But once my mom said that, you can imagine it sort of, that there's been a fire that put has been put in underneath the earth, and as the earth has been on the top of the fire, it's getting hotter and hotter. And that fire is because of our emissions. And at that time, as being a child, for me, only cars used to matter. I was really very confused that, how can us driving car, change the temperature of such a big earth, and how can, temperature being hotter be bad, because I used to like summers a lot at that time. So I was kind of confused. I was really curious, and I was scared of flooding as well. So all these things, drove me to learn more and more. And as I started learning, I see the loopholes of, how the governments have been working, how this whole political scenario has been working, how they've been crushing our future, our rights for the development, for the economic wealth and growth and all these stuff. So at a point, I felt like it's just enough, and it's somewhere, if no one will do it, I certainly have to take action for myself, for my life. And that made me, to take action and be activist in who I am today.
So following up on that, you started mentioning your activism. So what were the kind of things you started doing after this initial motivation was there? It was mentioned in the introductory video, you had this famous court case with the Indian government. Was that the first big step, or were there other things beforehand?
So I can say that was the biggest step, but eventually, before that, a year before I filed my petition against the government of India, I started living a sustainable life. I can't say it was proper sustainable, but I tried to reduce my own carbon footprints. I tried to save electricity, water. I tried not to waste food, which I used to do a lot as a child, and I tried not to use single-use plastic. I had to, cut down my consumption of my snacks because that created a lot of single-use plastic. So it was really tough, to give up on the things that you really liked. And to be honest, when I was a kid, I loved Coca-Cola, but eventually when I, when I came to the reality, I was like, it's not that great, and it affects my body and it's affecting the whole world as well. So I skipped, I just quitted it completely. It's very occasionally that I drink that. So it was really tough in the beginning, but these were the steps, very small steps that I took. But eventually what happened was that when, so it's like I read in an article that living a sustainable life, like bringing small changes can really help. So I thought in my mind that if I will live a sustainable life, things would change. So no more global warming, no more climate change, and things would be, nicer, and my future would be secured. So I didn't knew that it has to be a collective action when it comes to living a sustainable life to bring a change. I just thought just me living a sustainable life can change the whole world. So I lived it. I lived a sustainable life for a month or so, but I was able to see there are droughts occurring, flash floods occurring, the sea levels are still rising. So I was really confused that am I wrong, or was the article wrong, or did I did something wrong? I asked my mom, so many questions, and then she told me that it has to be a collective action if you want, people, sustainability to change up the whole things, and it can't really happen. There has to be a bigger action. And at that point of time, I felt like, what can be more bigger than, doing a petition against your government and, telling them on their forefront that you are doing this wrong and you have to be right in these ways. So I did my petition, my so-called landmark petition in 2017 at the National Green Tribunal, which is a green bench which takes all the cases related to environment. But my petition was dismissed after 1.5 years on the grounds that the government was doing everything right. And in my petition, it was clearly mentioned that the work has been going on paper and things are not being done on ground. And I want them to be on ground so that there could be real actions that, could change up the things and could change up the scenario. But after seeing this whole paperwork, they decided to dismiss my case. I took it to the Supreme Court, which is the highest court of India. So I can't take it further from there. So, and it's still pending there from over 1.5 years. It's kind of, it's going to be 2 years now. So it's just pending. But yeah, this is how I came to an idea to do that petition.
So you're kind of a little bit doubtful that you'll have success with the case. Yeah, right. I see. Well, having heard that, Martin, maybe we can talk now a bit about the solutions. Relima mentioned collective action, which has to be undertaken. You mentioned it in the first part of the session. You also touched upon the Green New Deal, saying that's a very important program. Why is that? Why the Green New Deal? Why is that such an important program which has to be undertaken and backed by collective action?
Well, let me just first respond to Radhika and say, if only more people in North America could, even at 3 times their age, go through that kind of consciousness elevation and realization, we would be in a much better position than we are now. I mean, I think in your short life, you've gone through a trajectory that I think many people still haven't reached, but need to, for us to get to the point where we can fight for a Green New Deal. Like, I think that capitalism for so long has thrived on people believing that being afflicted by structural problems of an exploitative system like poverty, joblessness, poor health, and now the climate crisis was actually just a personal deficiency, right? And the way in which our political and corporate-led system has put the burden of potential ecological collapse on the shoulders of individuals. I think that, what the story you tell is heartening for me, because I think that we are finally starting perhaps to see that the power of that ideological trick starting to dissolve. And of course we need people to consume less and innovate all kinds of low carbon alternatives. Building sustainable farms, inventing battery storages, all kinds of zero waste methods. But individual choices won't amount to anything unless the economic system we have can provide those options for everyone, not just an affluent or intrepid few. And I think that's the question that the Green New Deal tries to answer. Because if affordable mass transit isn't available to everyone, people will still drive their cars. If local organic food that is grown sustainably in a low carbon way is too expensive, people aren't going to opt out of the fossil fuel intensive supermarket chains. If we continue to mass produce cheap goods endlessly, people will buy them. So that has been the kind of con job of neoliberalism in this age, to persuade us to try to fight climate change through our pocketbooks, not through power and politics. And I think the Green New Deal returns questions of power and politics to the arena of the climate crisis. And it says that, look, eco-consumerism may be good to absolve your guilt, but it's only mass movements that can actually alter the trajectory of the climate crisis. And that will require a comprehensive economic justice, social justice, environmental justice agenda that offers millions and millions of people the opportunity to fight for a much higher material standard of living. I think for so long people posed climate change as a question of individual sacrifice. But what I think the oil companies were happy with that. If they knew that people thought they had to sacrifice to deal with the climate crisis. But in fact, people's lives, if we fight climate change in the right way, can immeasurably improve. Can provide more livable communities with affordable housing that is interconnected through public transit, better food, more leisure time, more public luxuries that aren't dependent on individualized, highly fossil fuel intensive recreation. All of those are solutions, I think, that are woven into the Green New Deal. I think they do what climate change solutions haven't done to this point, which is show that the 99% have everything to gain, and the only people who have something to lose aren't ordinary people, but the fossil fuel and corporate executives who have a stake in maintaining this destructive system.
So coming back to that point of collective action, Ridhima, whoops. You're back. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm back.
I hope that wasn't an environmental problem there.
No, it wasn't.
This point of collective action, have you been undertaking, climate activism together with others? Have you been trying to get in contact with others, movements, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, if I talk about it, like I started this thing all alone, and I guess when I started, there were not many people not many kids in general who were taking action, because I started in 2017, and this whole global movement like Fridays for Future and everything came in 2018 and stuff like that. So at the very beginning, I used to feel, that I'm the only one taking action and the weirder kid, that my parents had, that thinks about climate change, while everyone else is just like, they are just busy in their own lives and busy in their own stuff, and doesn't really care about, the environment, which is, making them to sustain on this planet, which I really felt was weird. But yeah, it's like gradually as a different movement started to, rise. I not officially, but I have joined Fridays for Future. I've been striking with them whenever I can, and I've taken, it's like I feel that somewhere awareness is really very missing amongst youth when it comes to climate change, and especially in my country. So I took this thing. So it's like my very first climate strike that I attended was in New York, the global strike. So it's like after attending that strike, I felt like there is something wrong in India. Why aren't these many people coming out on the streets and fighting for their rights for themselves and for the whole entire ecosystem? Why aren't they fighting against, the decision makers, those who are doing things wrong? So I, just felt like, there's lack of awareness and I should do something with that. So I started making kids aware about their rights, about climate change, about how it's affecting them. And so it's like basically I go to their schools and colleges and make them aware about things by having workshops or sessions with them. And rather than that, it's like I've been recently, it's like not earlier, but recently as things have started been online, I have gotten a more exposure, to connect with different communities of people, those who are working to drive a change. And, they are sort of working in a different perspective. Some are working for air pollution, some are working for water pollution, some are working to preserve their biodiversity of their particular region. So it's like I've joined many people, I've supported many people, and I have started joining different communities who are trying to drive a change, but it's not something which I used to do earlier. It's more of a kind of recent thing that I've started doing.
And you do these awareness programs at schools all alone, or is this in some organization?
So it's like this thing I do it alone. So it's like I just don't know. I just never find a perfect organization according to me, who could really help me out, because most of the time, most of the organizations look for their profits and stuff like that. And to be honest, it's a difficult thing to manage, traveling all around and your expenses and, going to schools and stuff like that. And also, getting a little help from them and, paying them as well. Because most of the time, if I ask people if they could help me out, if they want to join me, most straightforward is, most of the things starts from money and ends on money to people. So it's like I just felt like me and my dad felt like it's just good to do it alone. And yeah, I'm just doing it with help of my parents and, the lawyers who supported me to do my petition against the government of India.
So we can now also slowly move in the question and answer period. So if there are any questions from the audience, please put them forward. Until that's the case, I had one more question for you, Ridhima. Since you come from a country which historically shares quite a small burden in creating the climate crisis, and you're speaking with Europeans, someone from Canada, what's your feeling with regard to this imbalance that's there, since most of the emissions have been caused by Europe, North America, so on and so forth. What's it like being from a country that's on the other side of this?
It's like it's a bad thing. I won't say that, it's in, kind of in not that bad, but yeah, it's bad. But see, it's like I feel like each and every country is responsible as to the destruction which is happening right now. It's like it was, the developed countries or the one those who are, emitting the most are the one, somewhere destroying a lot more than, my country is. But still, my country is destroying a lot too, they're destroying their own biodiversity, even being the one most impacted and, not having that much privilege, to change up the things because we have a lot bigger population than most of the other countries. Some of it's like just China is, I guess, the only one who has a larger population than India, and next is India. Having such a big population, and then being a developing country. Rather than conserving their biodiversity, and because mostly it's like there are many. So it's like the majority of poor people is very high in India, and they being on the front line, they are the one most affected. So it's like rather than thinking about them and thinking about the whole country and thinking about their biodiversity, as we have a lot of biodiversity and nature all around us. So in spite of just protecting it, our policymakers are just busy in destroying that and giving forest clearances for airport expansions, for coal mines, for diamond mines, and they just want to gain more and more and more, and this greed never stops. And we have learned that it's human nature to be greedy, but I don't think so you can be this greedy that you can put lives of so many on stake, and just to them you would be like, we are doing great, and people would, most of the people are believing that. So I somewhere, just to conclude that, I just feel like it's a bad thing that we are not, you know were the one who created, who were that big contributors of this problem. But still, what have we done, being not being the one who emitted that much? We are not teaching them the lesson, but we are following their footsteps. We are somewhere, if they did it, we, it's just like a thing that, it's just like things that happens in siblings, that if my brother ate a chocolate, I want that too. It's just like that, if they did it, we want that too. We're not saying that our country shouldn't get developed, but it shouldn't be happening at the cost of the life of the children. So, at the cost of oxygen, at the cost of water, at the cost of our surroundings, our environment, our biodiversity. Yeah, that's how I feel. It's kind of a mixed feeling, so I can't really express it that way. That well.
Mm. Question from the audience, maybe for you, Martin. The question is, do you think it might be a good idea to impose some kind of Tobin tax on the investors and speculators who are making so much money from the green energy market? If that's something.
I mean, undoubtedly, yes. Like, any and all taxes should be on the table. Certainly, I mean, to me, it's a question not of the more difficult question is not whether there should be a Tobin tax. I mean, people have been pushing for a Tobin tax for decades now. The question really is, how do we build the popular power to impose it, right? But it goes without saying that if we want to have any chance of paying for the kind of green transition we know we need, we have to put our hands on the inordinate private wealth that exists, whose existence puts to the lie the notion of austerity that we have been sold for during our entire generation. Like, there is money there. It just happens to be sloshing around in private accounts, being funneled offshore, or is just sitting dead in accounts. Like in my country, in Canada, the corporate class holds $600 billion in accounts, and the notion that this wealth would trickle down was, of course, a fraudulent lie. And so now we have to go where the money is, put our hands on it, and use it to build a renewable energy post-carbon society.
By Sean Syne. have you considered starting a GoFundMe? I assume this is some kind of crowd funding platform for your court case, and then building the organization for fighting climate change that you want?
Is it for me?
Yes, that's for you. Yeah.
Okay. Eventually not, because it's just like we're not kind of. It's just like, I just don't know how to do these things and stuff like that. So I do have an organization. I set the organization up 1 year back, but I just didn't got the perfect people, as I always said, I didn't get the perfect people, or that proper team that I wanted to work with. And it's just like, my dad didn't got the time. I'm busy in my schoolwork. My mom is a government official, so she's busy in a lot other work. My dad is busy in his own work. So it's like we just doesn't get the proper time to start our organization. But rather than that, I haven't really had this idea to start a crowdfunding. That's a great idea. I might consider that.
So you're kind of still waiting and seeing with regard to this court case. You're just waiting for a reaction from the law jurisprudence. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just waiting. So it's like regarding my court case. So it's like, as my lawyers, Ritvik Datta and Rahul Chaudhary, they were my dad's friends, because they've been working for wildlife conservation and they are environmental lawyers, so they were friends. So eventually it's like my dad went to them to, just tell them that my daughter is suddenly excited to do a petition, and I don't know, whom should I contact, whom should we contact to be our lawyers, and what are the things that we should do, because he did this kind of petition, because he used to do PILs and petitions on different minings and poachings that used to happen for the wildlife, but he didn't did a certain kind of petition like that with a miner. So he asked them if they could help us in a way. So it's like at that time they were like that they will be our lawyers. So it's like, if it's about, my lawyers taking costs and stuff like that, it's not the case. They're just helping me, and my whole case has been going out without anything. So it's like they take funds from organizations from abroad. I guess Thomas not here. So yeah, so I was just telling that my lawyers take funds from abroad, so they help them. So they hasn't really took any money from me. So it's like, that's why we didn't really have that crowdfunding or stuff for my petition.
Sorry, I just had a technical problem there, so I didn't hear the last part of the answer. Maybe we there's one last question. Maybe we can end with that. Maybe this one is one for Martin. Maybe Ridhima, you'd also like to say something about it. Can you say something about degrowth? How do we escape the logic of perpetual economic growth when every polity seems to be aiming at growth?
Well, that's an easy one in a minute. No, that's an entire conversation in itself. I undoubtedly, like, of course, we have to get away from the commitment of our market economy to endless growth, which is pushing the planet to its brink. But I personally have a quibble with the language of degrowth, because I think the great challenge of our political moment is to have people feel that they have a positive stake in fighting climate change and winning a green transition. And I think the language of the Green New Deal, to my mind, is much more compelling in that it like, when I hear degrowth, I think it tells people that they will have less material well-being, less luxury, less pleasure. And I think there are certainly some elements of the economy, low carbon, no carbon, caring sectors, for instance, of healthcare and teaching, caring for our elders, caring for our children, that need to massively expand. And there are certainly some elements, the fossil fuel intensive ones, that need to contract. But I think that we can do better in terms of how we frame the struggle, by helping people understand how much their lives can benefit if they fight for a fossil fuel transition. Tom, you're muted again.
I guess we'll end it there, and thank you very much for being here both. It was a great discussion, interesting different perspectives from the activist side, the journalistic world. Yeah, and I hope these kind of conversations become more widespread and will take place more and more in the future. So thanks for being here both.
And thank you, Redeema, for inspiring us.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. It was really great talking to you.
Yeah. I'll just add as a last note, there's another session coming up from 7 p.m. to 8 o'clock Central European time on cybersecurity. So if you'd like to look at that, I'm sure it will be an interesting topic. And it will be moderated by my colleague Amir Kiai from the Task Force for the Alternative Security Conference. So thanks for both being here, and goodbye. Yeah.